Hello. 178 years ago, a man from Boston, Massachusetts wrote a story about politicians saying, hell with it, hiding in their ivory castles and watching a pandemic tear apart their world. In the spirit of Halloween, I'd like to read for you The Masque of the Red Death. I have a little bit of scotch, and I am comfy on a nice evening, and I just wanted to share a story with some friends. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal. The redness and the horror of the blood, there were sharp pains, a sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face, of the victim were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of these were the incidents of just half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They refused to leave means neither of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or from frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned, and with such provisions the courtiers might bid defiance to cognition. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provisioned all of the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, and there was wine. All of these and security were within, and without the Red Death. It was towards the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000th friend at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. These were 7, an imperial suite. In many places, however, such suites form long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here, the case was very different, as it might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but a little bit more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and to the left, in the middle of each wall, a tall, narrow Gothic window looking out upon a closed corridor, which perused the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied according to the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber in which it opened. That at an eastern extremity was hung, for example, a vividly blue, and it were its open windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth, furnished and lighted with orange. The fifth with white. The sixth with violet. The seventh apartment, which closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceilings and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the corridor of windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, no one of the 7 apartments were there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of gold ornaments that lay scattered to and fro depending on the room. There was no light of any kind emanating from a lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridor that followed the suite, there stood, opposed each window, a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tainted glass, and so glaringly illuminated the room. And thus were produced a magnitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the fire-staining light that steamed upon the dark hinges through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme. and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of all the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also there stood against a western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was so clear and loud and deep, exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that each lapse of hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance, and to hearken to the sound. Thus the waltzers' performance ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief discontent of the whole gay company. While the chimes of the clock rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged sedated passed their hands over their brows in confusion of reverie or meditation. But when the echoes of the hall fully ceased, a light laughter once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if their own nervous and folly, and made whispering vows to each other that the next chiming of the clock should produce them neither similar motion. Then, after a lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of time that flies, there came another chiming of clock, and then were the same discordant, tumultuous meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with a barbaric luster. There are some who would have said he was mad. His followers felt that he was not, and it was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the seven chambers upon occasion of this great fight, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantom, much of which had been seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, and something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have been excited to disgust. To and fro in the seven chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these dreams writhed about, talking of hues from room to room, causing in the wild music of the orchestra to seem as an echo of the steps, and anon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of velvet. And then, for a moment, all is still, and all is silent save for the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff, frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chimes die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after as they depart. Now and again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro merrily more than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through the streams that rave of the tripod. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven, there were now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is warning away, and the flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness and the sable drapery and appalls. And to him, whose foot falls upon the sable cabinet, there comes from a near clock of Everley a muffled purl more solemnly empathetic than any which reaches their ears who indulge in the remote gaieties of other appointments. But these apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and in the revel went whirling on, until at length commencing the sounding of the midnight upon the clock. As the music ceased, as I have told, and as the evolutions and waltzers were quieted, there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now that there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, more thought crept, with more time, in the meditations of those who had revelled. And thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals of the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. and the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose length from the company a buzz or murmur, expressive disapprobation and surprise. Then, finally, of terror, horror, and disgust. Here we go. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may have been supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such a sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited. But the figures in question had out-Heroded Herod, and had gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's infinitesimal Decameron. There are chords in the hearts of even the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with utterly lost to those whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company intended seemed now deeply to feel that the costume and bearing stranger neither wit nor properly existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a corpse that even the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty detecting the cheat. And yet, all this might have been endured if not approved by the mad revelers all around, but the murmur had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbed in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of his face, was besprinkled with scarlet horror. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon his spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as is more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed, in the first moment with the shoulders either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him, unmask him, that we may know who we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was his blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first he spoke, there was a sudden rushing movement from his group in the direction of the intruder, who, at the moment, was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which mad assumptions of the manner had inspired the whole party, there were found none who would put forth hands to seize him. And so, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while vast assembly, as one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms and walls, made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn measured step which had distinguished him from first, through the blue chamber, through the purple, from the purple to the green to the orange, and again through the white, even thence to the violet air, a decided moment had made arrest him. It was then, however, the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized them all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and when the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which, instantly after, fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage and despair of a throng of the revelers, threw themselves at the black apartment, and seizing the murmur, these tall figures stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, grasped in the unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they handled him so violent and ruthless, untangled them to any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in their blood-bedewed halls in their revel, and died in each desperate posture of their fall, and the life of the ebony clock went out without the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and the darkness and the decay of the Red Death held illimitable domain over all. There you go. Little fun, happy story.